Chapter 1. Introduction of Melchizedek in the Bible. The story of Melchizedek is fascinating and enigmatic, especially when we first encounter him in the Old Testament. His appearance is brief but full of symbolism and mystery, something that has intrigued scholars, theologians, and believers throughout the centuries. The Bible introduces Melchizedek in the book of Genesis, an ancient account that transports us to a moment of profound spiritual significance. He is not an ordinary character, nor one who appears with the usual background. His story begins without genealogy, without an introduction of his parents, or indications of his lineage. He simply emerges in the narrative, as if he transcends the boundaries of time. His first and only appearance in Genesis occurs in a notable context. After Abraham, the patriarch of the Hebrew people, returns from a great victory in battle. Abraham has fought against several kings to rescue his nephew Lot, and after winning, he meets Melchizedek on the way back. Melchizedek is not a common king. He is described as the king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. This title is important, as in the Bible there is no one else who holds the duality of king and priest. When Abraham meets him, Melchizedek comes out to greet him with bread and wine, a gesture that symbolizes hospitality and communion, and that immediately conveys a sacred atmosphere to that encounter. It is at this moment that Melchizedek blesses Abraham, proclaiming him blessed by the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth. This blessing is not just any religious act. It is a declaration from a priest to a chosen man, Abraham, who receives this blessing in a context of victory and faith. Something interesting here is the authority of Melchizedek. For Abraham, despite being a man with a unique relationship with God, not only receives the blessing with humility, but also gives Melchizedek a tithe of all he has gained. This act of giving the tithe reveals the respect and reverence that Abraham feels towards Melchizedek, recognizable in very few characters in the Bible. The figure of Melchizedek does not follow the traditional norms of biblical characters. Unlike other kings or priests, there are no records of his ancestry or his descendants. The absence of his genealogy surrounds him with a supernatural air, and some scholars see him as a being without beginning or end, someone who represents a direct connection with the eternal. Chapter 2. Roles and titles of Melchizedek. The role of Melchizedek unfolds with great strength in his titles and the profound meanings behind his name. Unlike other kings, Melchizedek does not rule solely over a city. He is the king of Salem. This title not only describes a physical place, but evokes a spiritual reality. Salem is associated with peace, and many believe it is an early reference to what will later be known as Jerusalem. Thus, being called King of Salem implies that Melchizedek is a leader of peace, and the essence of his rule seems to go beyond weapons or opulence, reflecting harmony and justice. This name, then, encompasses more than just a simple title. It describes his mission and his nature. But Melchizedek is not just a king. He is also mentioned as the priest of the Most High God. This role is especially significant in the Bible, as Melchizedek is presented as a priest before the formal establishment of the priesthood in Israel, which will be established much later with Aaron and the tribe of Levi. This priesthood is unique and direct, without the limitations or formalities that will be seen later in the Hebrew religious system. Melchizedek is, in some way, an eternal priest, someone whose connection with God does not depend on rituals, lineages, or human norms, but on a direct and profound relationship with the Creator. This makes him not only special, but singular in the entire biblical narrative. The symbolism behind the name Melchizedek adds even more layers to his character. Melchizedek means king of justice, and this justice is not human or partial justice, but one that emanates from God himself. This makes Melchizedek a symbol of an ideal of leadership where peace and justice are in perfect balance. His role as king and priest, combined with the meaning of his name, is a declaration that Melchizedek's purpose is to represent and reflect these values to those who cross his path. For Abraham, this encounter is not accidental. It is a meeting with a representative of divine justice and peace, something that undoubtedly marked him deeply. This mystery surrounding his roles and character establishes Melchizedek as a bridge between the earthly and the celestial, a king who does not seek power for himself, but rules to reflect the character of God. In him, we see an anticipation of what would be a perfect reign and an eternal priesthood. Chapter 3. The encounter between Melchizedek and Abraham. The encounter between Melchizedek and Abraham is one of those moments that seems to be laden with a significance that goes far beyond the scene itself. Imagine Abraham returning victorious after a hard-fought battle to rescue his nephew Lot and having faced multiple kings. In the midst of this triumphant return, Melchizedek, the mysterious king-priest of Salem, appears. The first thing he does is offer bread and wine, a gesture that may seem simple at first glance but holds deep symbolic meaning. This banquet is much more than a simple meal. It is a sign of communion and peace, an act of hospitality and blessing. In a moment of war and conquest, Melchizedek responds with an act of generosity and symbolism, a reminder that there is a kingdom of peace and justice that transcends the chaos of the world. Then, Melchizedek elevates the encounter even further by pronouncing a blessing over Abraham. It is not just any blessing, but a proclamation in the name of the Most High God, who is presented here as the Creator and the One above all. In this act, Melchizedek not only recognizes Abraham's greatness, but also his special relationship with God. For Abraham, hearing that blessing from a man who does not belong to his lineage or his land carries special weight. It is a reminder that God is with him, guiding and supporting him every step of the way. The blessing is, in itself, an affirmation of the promise that God has made to Abraham about his descendants and his role in the history of salvation. What happens next is equally impressive. Abraham, in response to this blessing and the spiritual presence of Melchizedek, offers him a tithe of everything he has gained in the battle. Giving a tithe to someone was a way of recognizing the authority and holiness of that person. And here Abraham acknowledges Melchizedek as a legitimate priest of the Most High God. This act of offering not only shows Abraham's reverence towards Melchizedek, but also aligns his victory with the divine will. It is as if Abraham is saying, "Everything I have comes from God, and I recognize that you are his representative." This encounter is not just an isolated moment. It is a declaration of the connection between Abraham's calling and God's purpose on earth. The relationship between them becomes a bridge that anticipates the priesthood and divine blessing that will mark the history of Israel. The communion of bread and wine, the blessing, and the tithe are elements that, later on, will take on even deeper dimensions in the biblical narrative, resonating through time as symbols of an eternal covenant between God and his people. Chapter 4. Melchizedek as a Messianic and symbolic figure. The figure of Melchizedek stands in the Bible as a true enigma, someone who, unlike other biblical characters, has no recorded beginning or end. Neither his parents nor his descendants are mentioned, a particularly notable detail in Hebrew texts, where genealogy is fundamental to establishing a character's identity and purpose. Melchizedek, however, seems to exist outside these limitations of time and lineage. This absence of a defined origin or marked end makes him a symbol that transcends his own era, a figure that evokes the eternal and the universal. He is a priest and a king, but not one limited to a single tribe or territory. His role goes beyond, pointing to something that cannot be contained within the limits of historical records. It is in the New Testament, specifically in the Epistle to the Hebrews, where the mystery of Melchizedek acquires an even deeper dimension. There he is presented as a figure who anticipates and prefigures Christ. The author of Hebrews makes a powerful comparison between Melchizedek and Jesus, explaining that both represent a priesthood that is not based on human descent, but on a divine choice. While the Levitical priesthood is anchored in genealogy, limited to those born in the tribe of Levi, Melchizedek and Christ are presented as priests by virtue of an eternal and irrevocable call from God himself. They are not restricted by the structures of lineage. Their authority and purpose are much higher. And this difference is crucial to understanding the relationship between Melchizedek and Jesus. This concept of an eternal priesthood is central to the comparison between Melchizedek and Christ. Being a priest without lineage, Melchizedek symbolizes a direct connection with the divine that does not depend on titles or hereditary rights. His priesthood is described as eternal, a quality that the author of Hebrews later attributes to Christ. Both represent a priesthood that has no end and does not exhaust itself, one that acts on behalf of God, not only in the present time, but in all times. It is as if Melchizedek, in his brief appearance in Genesis, were a foreshadowing of what Christ would fully embody, a priest and king who unites humanity with God in a covenant that will never end. This eternal priesthood is not just a theological difference, but a symbol of hope for those who seek God. The figure of Melchizedek reminds us that God's call is not limited by our history or our circumstances. Just as Melchizedek appeared without a recorded past, Christ came to offer a new beginning and a promise of eternal life. The figure of Melchizedek, therefore, becomes a symbol of grace that acts outside human structures, prefiguring the redemptive work of Christ and the covenant that transcends the limits of any era. In his mystery, Melchizedek transforms into an emblem of the divine promise, a promise that cannot be contained in a genealogy or a single moment, but encompasses time and eternity. Chapter 5. Theological Interpretation in the New Testament. In the New Testament, the role of Melchizedek takes on extraordinary relevance and expands beyond his brief mention in the Old Testament. It is in the Epistle to the Hebrews, specifically in chapters 5, 6, and 7, where we are given a theological vision that reveals the deep connection between Melchizedek and Christ. In Hebrews, the author takes Melchizedek, this mysterious king and priest, and presents him as a figure that anticipates the arrival of a perfect and eternal priest, Jesus. The interpretation in Hebrews describes Melchizedek not only as a historical character, but as a symbol of the priestly and redemptive role of Christ, one that surpasses and transcends the limits of earthly priesthood and the laws of Levitical descent. In Hebrews 5 verse 6, we find a clear statement. Christ has been called a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. This phrase resonates as a powerful echo of Jesus' purpose in human history and his connection with God's eternal plan. Unlike the Levitical priests, who were priests only by their lineage, Jesus becomes a priest not by earthly inheritance, but by a divine oath that grants him eternal authority. The phrase, according to the order of Melchizedek, highlights a continuity, not with the priests of Israel, but with one who represents an eternal priesthood outside of time and genealogies. In this way, Melchizedek serves as the perfect model of Christ's priesthood, one that does not need repeated sacrifices, nor is it limited to a single place or group of people, but acts as a mediator between God and humanity forever. This connection between Jesus and Melchizedek also underscores the concept of a superior priesthood. The author of Hebrews emphasizes that, while the Levitical priesthood could only offer limited and repetitive sacrifices, Jesus, as a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, offers an eternal and sufficient sacrifice for all. This sacrifice not only covers the sin of a nation, but the sin of all humanity, fulfilling the divine promises of peace and justice in a complete and definitive way. Through the figure of Melchizedek, the author of Hebrews highlights that Christ not only surpasses the Levitical system, but is the culmination of all of God's spiritual and redemptive promises for his people. Thus, Melchizedek becomes the symbolic reflection of the peace, justice, and grace that Christ will bring to the world. Just as Melchizedek was a king of peace and justice, Jesus is the fulfillment of that eternal peace and justice. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus inaugurates a new covenant, one that, like Melchizedek's priesthood, does not depend on human laws or specific lineages, but on a love and a promise that surpass any previous covenant. In this revelation, the mystery of Melchizedek becomes a key to understanding the redemptive work of Christ, the eternal priest and king, who came to accomplish what no earthly priest could, the complete and eternal restoration of the relationship between God and humanity. Chapter 6. Melchizedek in the context of God's promise to Abraham. Melchizedek appears in Abraham's story at a decisive moment, when God's promises begin to take shape in the patriarch's life. Returning victorious from a battle, Abraham meets Melchizedek, who not only offers him bread and wine, but also gives him a blessing that reaffirms the divine direction in his life. It is here, in this brief but significant encounter, that the figure of Melchizedek becomes a reminder of God's eternal promises to Abraham, linked with the faith and covenant that would change history. The blessing that Melchizedek gives to Abraham is much more than words. It is a divine proclamation that confirms Abraham's unique position as God's chosen one. By blessing him, Melchizedek reminds him that the Most High God is with him, guiding and protecting him. This blessing not only has an immediate impact, but also functions as a link between Abraham and God's promise. His descendants and the land promised to him will be part of a greater plan that affects not only Abraham, but all of humanity. In this way, Melchizedek is not only a priest of his time, but a representative of God's faith and fidelity towards those who follow him. And his presence in Abraham's story reinforces that everything that comes in his life is under the guidance of the Most High. Melchizedek's priestly blessing also confirms and strengthens Abraham's faith. By receiving this blessing, Abraham not only accepts Melchizedek's kindness, but also responds with reverence, giving him a tithe of everything he had gained in the battle. This act of humility and gratitude shows how Abraham sees in Melchizedek a greater spiritual authority, someone worthy of receiving his respect and worship. For Abraham, Melchizedek is a reminder that the path he is walking is much greater than himself, and that his covenant with God is real and protected. At this moment, Abraham understands that his faith is being affirmed by a figure that represents a pure and eternal priesthood, long before the priestly structure of Israel existed. And this gives him the strength and conviction needed to continue trusting in God's call, no matter the obstacles. This encounter between Melchizedek and Abraham prefigures something even greater. Melchizedek, in his role as priest and king, becomes a harbinger of the promise of an eternal priesthood that would come much later, in the figure of Christ. By blessing Abraham, Melchizedek establishes a connection between God's promises and the future of the people of Israel, and also with the promise of a Messiah who would bring an eternal blessing to all humanity. In the context of God's promise to Abraham, Melchizedek represents the continuity and faithfulness of God, who is building an unbreakable relationship with his people, a people that will flourish and be a blessing to the nations. In this crucial moment, Melchizedek not only confirms God's promises to Abraham, but also points to the arrival of an eternal blessing that will unite all those who believe, in a covenant that transcends time and generations. Chapter 7. Relevance and Significance in Contemporary Spirituality. The figure of Melchizedek continues to resonate in contemporary spirituality, reminding us of deep and fundamental values that keep the essence of Christian faith alive: justice, peace, and communion with God and others. Being called the King of Justice and King of Peace, Melchizedek becomes a model of spiritual leadership that seeks, above all, to live in harmony with God's will, something that translates into the pursuit of justice and peace in the life of every believer. In this sense, the story of Melchizedek invites us to reflect on these values, which should not only be understood as unattainable ideals, but as real and tangible practices in the daily life of those who seek to follow God's ways. Melchizedek's hospitality and his act of blessing Abraham are also presented as an image of communion and generosity, reflecting a spiritual disposition that not only gives, but also celebrates the bond of blessing between God and his people. By offering bread and wine, Melchizedek creates a space of unity and mutual honor, a symbol that points to the deep communion God desires to establish with humanity. This act of generosity is a call to contemporary faith, to be a people of communion, to receive and give generously, and to celebrate God's blessing in our lives and community. Melchizedek, in his hospitality and desire to bless, reminds us that every act of communion is an opportunity to strengthen our relationship with God and others, and to live as a reflection of his love and goodness. Melchizedek's spirituality, with his eternal priesthood, also marks a model of worship that goes beyond the transient. In a world full of changes and uncertainties, the figure of Melchizedek inspires today's believers to live a faith that transcends temporary circumstances, imitating his eternal character in dedication and worship to God. Just as Melchizedek was a priest of the Most High God without depending on a specific descent or lineage, followers of Christ are called to live a life of sincere worship, justice, and peace, as an authentic response to the grace they have received. Ultimately, Melchizedek is more than a historical or symbolic figure. He is a reminder of the values of justice, peace, and communion that every Christian is called to live. By following his example and understanding his relevance in our faith, we are invited to imitate that eternal priesthood, transforming our lives to reflect God's justice and extending the peace he grants. In the end, Melchizedek urges us to understand that our vocation as believers is to live with integrity and in communion with the Creator, being living reflections of his love and justice, not only in our personal lives, but in every interaction and relationship. If this video has touched your heart and been a blessing to you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to receive more content that strengthens your spirit. See you in the next video. God bless you.